How Black the Sky by T.J. Marquis. Pierce had never dangled before. He was surprised at himself to note that, actually. He'd lived near the rim for a time, and most people tried it at least once. For recreation, it was a terrible choice. Neither was it a good job, yet it was a fundamental part of life on Overland, and he felt he would gain greater appreciation for the professional dangler after today. Pierce now hung from a mage-woven rope of carbon fibres that was anchored on a boulder up above. Every dangler had a spotter up on top of the plateau, as well as a horn player watching for banshees. He could already hear the awful things in the distance, shrieking dissonant songs into the void. When they noticed the danglers by Chasm verge, the banshees would come to harass them and slay them if allowed. Gorgonbane hoped to get as much work done as possible before danger set upon them. Pierce didn't know a lot of songs by heart, but he did have a naturally strident tenor that he thought would come in handy here. He could probably make up a melody on the spot if he needed to. He began to sing, warming up his voice for the inevitable confrontation. Meanwhile, he lowered himself on the carbon rope, hammer and chisel hanging from his belt. Sev had said the veins of silicon were hard to spot at first. It was a reflective metalloid with nothing to reflect but the dark of the chasm. The danglers would have to shine their lamps on the face of the cliff, searching for anomalies foot by foot. Thankfully, the veins were plentiful, and Pierce found his first one within a few minutes of descent. He tugged on the rope once to signal he'd found the deposit, and his hornblower tugged back in response. Pierce took out a hammer and chisel, searching for the boundary between metalloid and the dark stone around it. The stone of the cliff face was cleaner than Pierce had imagined. Perhaps the banshees neglected to defecate on these walls because they were close to the old wizard's home. There was still indication of the banshees' nasty habits, though. Streaks of dried up guano left crusty vertical tracks. At least most of it was dry. Pierce could already imagine the smell in an area the banshees had taken a shine to. Pierce began to chip away the stone of the cliff face. He was supposed to excavate to a certain depth all the way around and dislodge the biggest chunk of silicon he could. There was a rope dangling above his head with a bag tied to it that would be hauled up once he'd put some of the metalloid in it. He liked this kind of work. Repetitive actions with a clear goal always helped him to maintain focus. It wasn't tiring either. Most cliff danglers were people who couldn't find a better job, even though it paid well. Typically, the job was considered distasteful due to the high risk of death by banshee. Pierce couldn't speak to that yet, but so far he was thinking that if he couldn't be a professional warrior, this might be something he could stick with. Pierce's strength helped him to work faster than the other soldiers that had been sent over the side of the cliff. Within half an hour, he'd secured a good-sized chunk of silicon, like a slice of pie, and sent it up above. Not long after that, the horn sounded. It wasn't a typical horn signal, but a bright, rising melody. The soldier trumpeting actually wasn't too bad, which was good for Pierce. He turned his head out to the chasm and saw the banshees coming. They flew in looping, erratic patterns, and there was anger in their movements. Pierce knew that the banshees never failed to appear. Humans weren't supposed to be in the chasm, apparently. So the banshees asserted whenever someone dangled or otherwise invaded the space above the chasm. S had said they would even come after someone trying to fold across the gap in the earth. But why? No one had ever been able to ask, for the banshees were wild things, with bodies of both air and flesh, and they were not interested in conversation. The horrid things came nearer, and Pierce remembered to keep singing. He'd forgotten at some point during his work. "Keep mining!" came a distant voice from above. Right, He had to keep going. No distractions. Trust the music. He turned back to the silicon, fighting the urge to look back at the banshees. He wasn't so much afraid of them, it was more that his instincts were screaming for him to defend himself. Yet, even if his sword were able to cleave the flesh of the ghoulish beasts, there was nothing he could do to harm their evil spirits. So he mimed and sang, and up above the horn player serenaded. After several minutes, his curiosity got the best of him, and he checked on the status of the banshees. They had entered a holding pattern, flying in anxious loops just 100 yards away, faces locked in perpetual expressions of confused anger. They wanted to come and rip the cliff danglers to shreds, but the music held them at bay. After an hour or so of working and sweating at the end of the rope, with the cacophonous song of the banshees stabbing his mind, Pierce finally began to feel the sickness and fatigue he'd always heard about. Toxic banshee song. He needed to end the shift before he made a stupid mistake. Reluctantly, he tugged out the signal on his rope, and shortly the men above began hoisting him up. The shrieks of the banshees grew frenzied, sticking needles of vertigo into his brain. He glanced backward again. They had pressed closer. Despite the pain or discomfort the music caused them, they didn't want this prey to get away. Pierce got his arms over the top of the cliff, and the men up there helped him mount it. They gave him hearty pats on the back and congratulated him on a good take. It didn't seem like much to Pierce, compared to what he imagined Sev needed for the enchantment. Just 3 chunks the size of a man's chest, and a handful of other small pieces and scraps. Pierce looked out over the chasm. The banshees were already gone. No meal for them this day. He looked down the line of the cliff's edge. Everyone else had already come up. How many times would they have to do this? When would somebody's luck run out? He didn't fancy finding out firsthand what the banshees could do to a man if they caught him. Sev was duly impressed by the day's take, and that did Pierce's heart good. He may not have trusted his own sense of what constituted a victory when mining the chasm wall, but he trusted the Forge Masters. Everyone who'd worked this shift was treated to a sumptuous meal back at Chasmgard. It had only been a few hours' work, but Pierce felt like he'd tried to fight a duel after drinking too much the previous night. Knowing his own impressive endurance, he felt sorry for the garrison soldiers, and a little proud of them too. To brave that chasm without any special skills, without enchanted armament, well, it was brave. They spent days like this, sometimes squeezing 2 or 3 shifts in, if the banshees happened to be a little less taxing on everyone's psyches. Gradually, the stockpile of painstakingly mined silicon grew, and Sev set to work growing his crystals. He was all too willing to share his methods with the first and second, much to their wizardly delights. F had provided Sev with equipment and a laboratory, and the 3 of them spent hours in it discussing the Forge Master's art in terms Pierce couldn't understand. He would spend his breaks watching Sev work, though just curious about how the Forge Master had passed his days down in the Underlands. The process was slow, methodical, precise. Sev must have had legendary patience. He had to be still, his mind quiet, with no thoughts for things outside of the lab. Pierce didn't think he could do that, but he supposed in an abstract way Sev's work was similar to his own life's calling. In a fight, a duel, or a battle, Pierce couldn't allow himself any distractions, any doubts about his ability. He couldn't let his mind be drawn toward things that didn't pertain to the fight. That focus and passion for their work, it was something the 2 of them had in common. Maybe that was why Pierce had ultimately been drawn to his new friend. 6 days into the project, and they were a little over half done by Sev's reckoning. Sev had praised the pureness of the silicon the teams were bringing up. He said the veins in the Underlands, though plentiful, were often shot through with other elements, silver, gold, platinum, that had to be discarded for their uselessness. He seemed to grow more excited, working quickly and smiling often. Pierce had taken the first shift as usual, and now he was over the edge, sweating as he chiseled at the cliffs. He swore his voice had grown stronger in the last few days. He sang his songs boldly, and the banshees continued to remain at bay. He was chipping away mindlessly at the stone when he heard a yelp from the next position eastward. Oh! The soldier working there must have lost his grip on his tools. Pierce could see the gleam of metal as they fell into the chasm. The man flailed, trying to catch the tools, and swatted away his hauling sack. The spotter and trumpeter up above took the movement as their signal to haul both the soldier and his sack up, and the man stopped singing to try and holler that he wasn't ready yet. The banshees, forgotten for the moment, took their chance and rushed in. Keeping unusually quiet as they did so, coming in low, they had learned. They had been waiting. Pierce hollered at anyone who was listening, trying to keep a melody in his voice as he did so. He didn't know what to yell, so he just ended up stammering loudly. He tried to gauge the distance to the soldier in trouble. If there were any kind of foot or handholds, he could make it. But the cliff was sheer, slick. His boots wouldn't get a grip. He'd left his sword up above, knowing it would do no good against the banshees anyhow, so he couldn't cut into the cliff. He kicked it, propelling himself away. He kicked and kicked again, making a tiny crater in the rock. He pushed off of it, trying to generate a lateral swing. The banshees had almost reached the man. His spotter had almost gotten him to the top of the cliff, and might have finished if the trumpeter had been helping, but he was busy unloading the silicon from its sack. It wasn't surprising, this lapse in procedure. They'd been at this for days. It was easy to let one's guard down when one had repeated an action 100 times. The banshees shrieked at last, pouncing on the hapless soldier, grasping his legs with their clawed hands. They yanked him away from the cliff face violently, pulling the spotter up above off his balance. He stumbled toward the edge of the chasm, screaming in shock as he finally saw the banshees. He tried to scramble backwards across the ground, but the lowering rope was tied around his waist. He fumbled at it. Pierce had gotten a good swing going, and his trumpeter was looking down from above in confusion. Pierce waved him away, put a thumb to his lips to indicate the man should make sure to keep playing. He nodded and played all the louder, looking toward the man who'd been caught. There was no way Pierce could reach him, and if he did, there was nothing he could do to help. The dangling miner was in the grasp of half a dozen banshees, and they tore at him in a mad rage. One bit into his leg below the knee, and Pierce heard the snap of bone, the rip of flesh as the banshee tore his lower leg off entirely. It didn't even care to feast on the limb, just carelessly let it fall into the chasm. The banshee noticed the spotter fumbling at the rope around his waist, unable to get free. It grasped the rope and began to pull while its brethren continued to rip the first man apart. The trumpeter tried to hold on to the spotter, and both of them were getting pulled toward the chasm's edge. The banshee yanked another time, and the spotter went over the side, hanging from his waist and swinging down below the miner he'd been responsible for. The trumpeter had let go and was laying on his stomach at Chasm's edge, staring in shock. The banshees relished in their kills, now swarming both men that had fallen, rending flesh. One cut into the spotter's belly almost carefully, drinking in his screams of pain. When there was nothing left to tear apart, the banshees wheeled away into the dark below and the air grew eerily quiet. Pierce stopped swinging and just let himself hang. He couldn't believe what he'd just witnessed, and he'd never felt so powerless. Morale took a plunge after that incident, and the mining teams agreed to call it quits for the day. Of course, everyone knew that tragedy could strike at any moment. Dipping into the chasm for any amount of time was known to be a deadly risk, but knowing something could happen was a far cry from actually experiencing it. At first, Pierce was accepting of it, watching the chasm while leaning back on the wall of the annex tower and sipping at some mead. The more he thought about it, though, the more he began to feel a burning inside. He hated that he hadn't been able to stop the banshees from claiming their prey. All those garrison troops had left was each other. Their families were gone, and the city they'd called home. He knew, of course, that he couldn't have done anything significantly different if he'd been up top of the cliff and armed. He simply wasn't equipped to fight creatures like the banshees. It seemed no one was. That didn't make it sting any less. An indignance mounted within him, and he started pacing. What about those two wizards cooped up in the tower? Could S or F have done something to repel or destroy the banshees? It certainly seemed that they were powerful enough, but if that was the case, why hadn't they been down on the ground helping? Pondering this, Pierce found it difficult to stay put. He didn't know if his thoughts were rational on this count, but he quickly got to the point where he didn't care. He stomped off around the curve of the tower, making for its open doors. He climbed the steps inside, making for the Forge Master's lab. At least one of the wizards was likely to be there. He opened the door to the lab impatiently, storming in, at this point ready to holler. But his eyes found S there, watching Sev's work intently, and his rage dimmed a little. She looked innocent, like a perfect little doll, eyes half-lidded as she gazed down at Sev's hands. Her silver hair hung down on the right side, and the left she had tucked back behind her ear. Her white lips were slightly parted, and a small crease had formed in her brow. She'd finally deigned to change out of her robe and into work clothes. They were too big, but still managed to hug her slender frame. Pierce realized he was staring. He'd almost forgotten why he'd come. S, he said. She looked over at him, eyes not quite focused, as if she was still lost in whatever thoughts she'd been having. S, why weren't you or F down at the cliffs? Pierce asked, more softly than he'd meant to. Why haven't you been all this time? Finally, she registered his presence fully and surfaced from the depths of her thought. Pierce, she said, what do you mean? You, in all your power, or F, who you say knows even more magic than you do, why aren't you helping to protect the men from the banshees? As Pierce thought about it, some of his ire began to surface again. He felt a mixture of guilt, one that the mere presence of this lovely girl could so easily disarm his rage, and another that he had started to speak sharply to her. Pierce, no one can harm the banshees, she said patiently. You know this. Everything that can be tried has been. No, he said. There's always a way. Maybe you just haven't found it. There is no way, S asserted. I assure you. Sev kept working as if he didn't hear the argument at his back. Even if you really think that, Pierce said, why do this instead of trying something new? He gestured at Sev, working his magic on the growing crystals. Be out there, amplify our music, cover us with protective wards, try something. Pierce, S sighed. She didn't look insulted or challenged at all. She looked vaguely weary, in fact. No, he continued. The argument was doing good for his determination. Her beauty did not abate, but it was having less of an effect on him. He wouldn't back down. You, both of you, should be giving this expedition priority. What else matters, he said. If Cash takes Overland, if we die, what will matter if you know how his Forge Masters work their enchantments? Pierce, she said, still unnaturally calm. You are young. Me? I can't be that much younger than you, he said. That's beside the point. No, Pierce, it's not, S said, and I am not young. I have seen 100 years as of the last green moon. You have heard our stories. How could you imagine I was not your elder? Pierce's jaw dropped. It was one of those odd things that the mind refused to put together. He felt foolish. 100? No. S chuckled and smiled. Yes, I may not look it, but such is the blessing of these magics combined with the blood of my heritage. But that's not the point of mentioning it, she said. There are many things one can learn, do and try in a century. My master has been learning for over 400 years. There is little he does not yet know. And, as any good student, my primary goal is to surpass him in all ways. Capturing Cash will help me achieve that. Pierce couldn't say anything in response. Despite himself, he was looking at the highness of her cheeks, the suppleness of her bare arms sticking out of the sleeves of her work shirt. 100? When I say you are young, I mean that you have not yet learned to accept what you can and cannot change, she said. I'll never, he started, but she held up 2 dark fingers to stop him. And you won't learn until the years have taught it to you. I can tell you the things that I know about life, about our Overland, but I cannot make you grasp reality in the same way I do. I can ask you to make your choices as if you understood the wisdom I would give you, but I cannot ingrain that wisdom in you by force. I can appreciate wisdom and philosophy, Pierce said, his spirits dimming slightly. It was hard to stay riled when she was so calm, when she did seem wise, when she continued to be so lovely. He groaned softly without thinking, hoping she hadn't heard it. S laughed. You are like a puppy that has been reprimanded. And I do not mean that as an insult, it is endearing, Pierce. She put a hand on his arm, and his blood rushed. You do listen to your elders, she said. You do learn, and it is much to your credit that you have the discipline to submit to us. What I am saying is that you cannot know fully what we would teach you until you have both practiced it and grown into it. Only with experience and age do the mysteries of youth begin to make sense, just in time for new mysteries to appear. Pierce was calmed but not placated. I just can't stand for it. When there could be another way, he said. Not that he knew what that way could be. "And again," said S, "it is to your credit that your sense of justice refuses to be quenched. Keep that quality, Pierce, and let it grow to be girded with wisdom." She glanced back towards Sev and his work. Pierce guessed that was it. He'd been dismissed. He couldn't think of what else to say to her in that moment. He would have to think about it. He turned toward the door. "Sorry about the noise, Sev," he said to the Forge Master. "It is no trouble," said Sev. "It is hard to distract a Forge Master from his work." He didn't turn, but Pierce imagined the man's flat smile appearing for a moment. What had he thought about all of that, and how old was Sev anyway? Not for the first time in this group, he felt a bit like a child. There seemed to be an entire chasm between himself and the legends he'd fallen in with. Usually he didn't mind, but now it left him unsettled. Scythia revelled in the race with her husband, hooves and claws of their mounts scraping the hard ground, wind pulling her long dark hair out of its restraints. She watched Axborn ahead of her, riding his Raptorian with masterful control. He moved fluidly with the beast, and she could see the muscles of his back flexing as he rode through the thin material of his tunic. Despite the circumstances, she could tell he enjoyed the mad gallop too. Peace had sounded nice, back in Nux. Resting there for a time, allowing their guard to drop would have been a welcome relief from the years they'd spent at war. They could have settled in, maybe even considered a family again. But the winds had shifted all too soon. And here they were, one battle behind, more ahead. It was good though. To come up against these things together, Scythia could no longer imagine surviving life in all its violent fits of surprise without a love, without Axborn by her side. Every now and then he would turn his head to check her position. She saw the squint in his eyes as he considered letting her catch up, and the gleam when he decided not to. Good, she thought. Let it be a contest. The Bloodhoof was naturally the faster beast, but Axborn had always been the better rider. Even Nova's love of her new master could not compensate for Scythia's imperfect skill. Still, Axborn would brook no lack of enthusiasm on his wife's part, and Scythia pushed on as hard as she could. She meant to catch him, if not pass him up. They were sprinting toward the town of Sheev to catch up on news from the wider world. It would have taken long for news to reach this far-flung place, but F refused to fold somewhere blindly, and S said she needed to watch over the silicon miners from atop F's tower. Pierce had apparently convinced her to stand guard. Scythia was just hoping a well-trained messenger mage would have been considerate enough to bear tidings of the invasion out here. A wave of relief washed over her when the town appeared on the horizon. It had only been a few days since they'd ridden through on the way to Chasmgard, but anything could have happened in that time. The town wasn't razed or even on fire, and there were no signs of those wicked singing obelisks or any of Cash's monsters. There wasn't much traffic in the streets, but it had been a sleepy town anyway. Scythia spurred Nova on hard, and the Bloodhoof seemed to understand. This wasn't about reaching Sheev sooner, it was about trying to beat Axborn. He turned his head and laughed mirthfully, digging his heels into the Raptorian's sides. It surged forward, and Nova strove to match it. Come, little Bloodhoof, know that you are the wind, Scythia thought. For a few moments they were connected, mount and rider, and she felt Nova's desire to meet her expectations. She also felt Nova's strange animal doubt. It was almost a submission to the Raptorian ahead, simply because the reptilian beast had already established dominance. What a peculiar sensation this was. but the Bloodhoof's speed was part of its nature, and soon Nova came up neck and neck with the Raptorian. Axborn beamed at his wife. Scythia grinned back. Neither noticed in the end who technically won as they surged into town. An old man looked up from his stoop in the slowest, calmest glance of surprise Scythia had ever seen. His mouth moved, but she couldn't hear the words over the Bloodhoof's slowing gait. They cantered into the centre of town and found its quaint tavern. They tethered the animals outside. The barkeep was leaning back on a stool, both booted feet up on the bar. He was reading some weathered old book that had lost both front and back covers, and he didn't bother to glance up until it was time to turn the page. He set the book down and greeted his customers levelly. "Ain't got much," he said. "No shipments since Grondel got sacked." So some news had made it here. The raising of Grondel was still the biggest. "Mostly we came in for news," said Scythia, taking a stool at the bar. Axborn scanned the place cursorily and joined her. "We knew about Grondel. Have you heard of anything else?" The barkeep slipped off his stool and onto his feet. He rummaged under the bar for something, producing a dusty old bottle that was still sealed. "You drinking?" he asked, fetching 2 short glasses. Scythia knew he wouldn't speak freely unless they bought some of his drink. Even with the end of Overland on their very doorsteps, a man had to conduct his business. Axborn fished 2 gold thumpers out of his purse and let them fall onto the bar. They thumped. It was an extravagant amount. The barkeep nodded appreciatively. He opened the old bottle and set it down between the glasses. "Why don't you share it with us?" Axborn said. "We have to ride back. I won't want more than 1 or 2. The barkeep shrugged and got himself a glass. He poured for everyone and resumed his seat. "2 cities gone," he said. "1 each day after Grondel. Messenger said it went just the same as the Temple City. You heard that part?" Scythian nodded, heart sinking. 2 more cities. "Weird singing towers," the barkeep said. "Make you barf up your guts. Giants smashing everything in sight, nothing left behind." "No fortress this time?" Scythia asked. The barkeep shook his head. "Don't think so. Not that I was told anyway. I mean, there's only 1 Testadel. Maybe he couldn't push up a lesser fortress. Or maybe he was saving them for something bigger. Grondel was important, but it wasn't the biggest city in Overland." "Which 2 cities?" Scythia asked. She took a swig of her drink for the first time. It was clear and light, but ignited a fire in her throat and her belly. Something more than mead. She watched as Axborn drank. His eyes lit up and she chuckled inwardly. He loved the heat of it. "Chasm Reach and Shrill," the barkeep answered. Scythia's heart sank further. Chasm Reach had been her home. Axborn set his drink down hard and looked up at the barkeep. The man flinched, as if surprised Axborn would care. "You're sure?" Axborn asked. "Chasm Reach?" The barkeep nodded. Axborn looked at his wife. "I'm sorry, darling." He put a hand on her back, but didn't watch her face for long. He knew better than to do any more than that. When she needed more, she would ask. Scythia took the news as stoically as she could, but it was a punch to the gut. Something that had always been was now no more. Something far more personal than Grondel or the Temple. A place where she had memories, where she had learned love and hate, and the drive to seek the wider world. It wasn't as if any of her family was still around to have died in the attack. Still, it had been home. If the barkeep said anything more, Scythia didn't hear it. She was no longer Scythia of Chasm Reach. They rode back toward Chasm Verge, slowly and in silence. Axborn knew she would talk when she was ready. It was many miles before she felt so, and when at last she did, everything came out in an incoherent flood. She suffered the deluge of old memories, long-missed images of her parents, the grands, uncles and aunts and cousins. She shared some of these with Axborn as she wept, though he had long ago heard most of her stories, and she his, but he listened as if it were the first time. She asked him if they could stop for the night. It wasn't late, it wasn't yet even dinner time, but she didn't feel like being cooped up in the wizard's tower yet. She needed more fresh air, more open space, and to the chasm with it, if they were attacked out here in the wild. Axborn agreed readily. He'd always liked sleeping out under the moon anyway. They laid out pallets and made a fire. Axborn ate, Scythia did not, and they talked and held each other until the silver moon slid high overhead. At last they lay back together under the deep, black sky and loved each other fiercely, dispelling the darkness for a time. When all was said and done, Pierce and the garrison men had provided Sev with more silicon than he'd needed to grow the magnificent crystals he'd used to distill that glorious blue light. They were long and fat, most as big as a child, some as big as a man. Sev had used his strange craft to enchant each seed crystal with an almost biological need to grow quickly and large. And so the whole process hadn't taken as long as S and F had expected. Naturally, they had wanted to know all about the enchantment and process, and now they did. The crystals had been taken outside, and every day at dawn Sev sat with them, using a peculiar power to draw the sunlight into his big hands as it passed through them. Despite the two wizards' intense curiosity, Sev insisted he couldn't teach them how to perform the last step, for it was something only his race could do, as far as he knew. The blue light congealed in his hand, and he crushed it in his palm like a physical thing. After holding it in a tight grip for long minutes, he would release it, and bright blue dust would fall out instead of light. This was diligently collected and stored in large urns that dwarfed the tiny vial Sev had previously gifted to Pierce. Pierce kept urging the Forge Master to pace himself, but Sev worked almost feverishly with a single-minded purpose. He'd eat something for breakfast and get to work, not stopping for a midday meal, working until the very last rays of the sun had disappeared. He said the work was his sustenance. He'd even commented that he would work through the night if the light of the moon were of sufficient strength for his needs. F dropped by from time to time, inspecting the growing stockpile, and after 3 days he deemed it enough, seeming vaguely proud of the fact. Pierce supposed the lesser wizard would need more to get the job done. The first said he would commence the enchantment the next morning. Another couple of miners had been lost to the banshees, but their spotters had not been taken with them. Though the losses sat heavily on people's hearts, it wasn't really too severe compared to the typical fatality rate of a cliff dangler. The team had done a good job here, and all the men made sure to thank their trumpeters and spotters. Though news had come in that yet more cities had been conquered, that now there were bands of Gen and werewolves roving the roads between the nations of Overland, spirits at Chasmgard were high. It could all be over within a matter of hours. The sky would be a beautiful blue, bathing the land in more light than it had ever seen, and the invaders from below would have to shade their black eyes and slink back into the holes from whence they had come. Men were already congratulating Pierce on the success of his idea, and he accepted the praise in sheepish silence. He couldn't sleep that night. He paced and roved the grounds all around Chasmgard, thinking about everything that could come next. Sometimes in his mind, the first would fail, the sky would remain black, and Cash would conquer the world. In many fantasies, F would succeed, and S would embrace Pierce in girlish joy, rewarding him with a kiss for his ingenious plan. He felt stupid for his imaginings, but couldn't help himself. They played behind his eyes throughout the night like waking dreams. With little else left to explore, Pierce eventually made his way up to the top of the tower, idly inspecting the green stone of its many spires, with one hand as he gazed out into the dark. The stockpile of blue dust had been brought up here, waiting for F to begin the enchantment. Sunrise should be coming soon. A breeze had kicked up, and he noticed it wasn't coming from the chasm below as it usually would. It was like something was blowing on him gently from the north, like a truly massive giant's breath was escaping as it slept. Pierce didn't like the thought of a giant larger than the mega monstrosities he'd fought at Grundel. There wasn't typically strong wind of any kind further inland. It was something one only experienced at the edges of Overland. He supposed this horizontal breeze could be something normal at Chasm's edge he simply hadn't experienced yet. But it seemed wrong, somehow. Suddenly he realised why. The obelisks at Grundel, they had vibrated, emanating their sickening sounds, shaking his insides until Scythia had covered everyone with her enchantment of silence. Could they be causing a wind like this? It had already gotten stronger, but he could hear no evil tones yet. He wanted to tell himself he was overthinking things, that he was just paranoid at the thought of his idea's failure, yet his intuition had never steered him wrong. "P.S." came a call from down below, on the winding stair that led up to the tower's pinnacle. It was Scythia's voice. "Are you up here? The guard said he saw you heading upward." "I'm here," he called back. Soon Scythia appeared on the stair, the first right behind her. He looked groggy, as if he'd just been awakened. He was even still in his night robe. "Something's coming," Scythia said. The gems on her circlet were pulsing brightly, either to simply attack or to stop the enchantment. Though I don't know how Cash would know about that. She guided F firmly to the stockpile of blue dust, and he began to fumble about his preparations. "S, Agrathor, and Axborn will guard the first," Scythia said. "You and I will be at the ready below. If the obelisks begin to crop up, we must topple them. If the mega monstrosities begin to arise, we must slay them. The garrison men are precious few, but they will fight their best beside us." Pierce nodded. "I'll arm myself," he said, making for the stairs. "Good," Scythia said. "I'll wait with F till the others arrive and join you on the ground." Pierce passed Sev on the way down, apparently awoken also by Scythia's stirring of the others. "What can I do to help, Pierce?" Sev asked. "I am not much of a warrior." "But you're strong," said Pierce. "You can fight if you have to. Get armed, at least for your own safety. Guard the tower doors." Sev nodded once. "We just have to hold out until the first is done," said Pierce, and bounded down the stairs to the floor his room was on. Armoured, sword at his side, Pierce made his way to the ground floor and outside. The breeze was now a wind, and Pierce could hear the faint humming that he dreaded. But he could not see the obelisks creating it. He kept expecting to see the hands of the mega monstrosities digging up out of the ground, but they too seemed to be delayed. Then he heard the whooping and howling of a werewolf pack, likely several dozen of them. The sound of their approach grew gradually. Scythia joined him, followed by the remainder of the garrison men, and they braced themselves, weapons drawn, awaiting the arrival of the enemy. "The first has begun the enchantment," Scythia said, lowly. "He said it should not take long." Pierce glanced up. The tower's zenith was glowing dully with blue light. Soon the werewolves were in sight. The first timid rays of the sun revealing their silhouettes in the distance. Each one of their red eyes seemed fixed on the two warriors who waited. Lightning struck them suddenly, and those who were hit yelped in surprise as they were rent by the blast. The loose formation scattered, galloping toward the tower's meagre defenders all the more wildly. 7 orange balls of liquid fire shot down from above, cutting through the werewolves like wet paper. Hairy limbs fell to the ground, and the deadly orbs left trails of blood and gore in their wake. The pack of werewolves was slain before they even reached the defenders. In their absence, the obelisks began to appear. Pierce saw the sharp points of the monoliths pushing up out of the bare ground in a wide arc clearly meant to hem the defenders in, to trap them against the edge of the chasm. Immediately their sick songs rang out into the air. Scythia touched her amulet and silence fell around her. She and Pierce dashed for the nearest budding obelisks. Pierce waited for it to rise and stop, then began hacking at its base with his sword. The thing toppled and fell in incongruous silence. Scythia was attacking another obelisk with her flail. Her fierce strength was channeled through the chain and spiked ball, every impact sending cracks and shudders up the brittle structure. Eventually it fell, splintered into 1,000 pieces. They moved on to the next pair. Pierce dared a glance back at the top of Chasm Verge. The dull blue light had become intermittent bright flashes that shot up into the sky, like the first was working to ignite some heavenly fire. Another pack of werewolves was on the way, a battalion of Gen in their wake. Above the Gen glided black shadows that Pierce had not seen before. No, they weren't gliding. They were bounding forward in great, long leaps. What were those things? The wind continued to mount as if it was meant to blow the tower over into the chasm. As if this weren't strange enough, the ground itself had begun to shake. Pierce expected to see the mega monstrosities emerge at any moment. Agrathor jumped down to the ground and cast his lightning on the obelisks, blowing them apart with surprising ease. Yet, for every one that fell, another was rising to replace it. Their wicked song wasn't audible within the aura of Scythia's silence, but Pierce still flinched at the memory of it. S's liquid orbs were extremely efficient at killing the loping werewolves, but inevitably a few got through to Pierce, and he engaged them grimly. They fought with the cunning of beasts and men combined, and they engaged him in groups of 5 or 6, surrounding him with nips at his extremities and feigned attacks. He tried to keep track of as many of them as he could, but inevitably one would get in behind him and try to rend him with its claws while he was fending off one of its packmates. Pierce slew one, with a swift cut upwards through its torso. Blood and liquid bone spilled onto the ground. He dodged back as another werewolf dashed in to clamp its jaws on his sword arm. It caught him, but its teeth broke against Pierce's enchanted armor, and it opened its maw in a howl. Flinching with the intense pain, Pierce beheaded it. He glanced sideways at Scythia, who was also beset. The werewolves were swift, but her bracelet made her faster. The eyes of the monsters were wide in bewilderment as she dashed to and fro among them, smashing their skulls in with precise strikes of her sister's flail. Despite her skill, a horde of Gen was almost upon them, and obelisks were continuing to crop up behind the advancing enemy lines. The shadows, taking long leaps among the Gen, had split off and made for the tower, ignoring its defenders. They looked to have black skin like S's, and they were clad in loose black clothing that fluttered as they cut through the air. They were too far away to stop as they began to climb the sheer face of the tower, somehow finding handholds in the smooth green stone. Pierce would have to leave them to the others atop the tower. He slew the last werewolf that had accosted him, cleaving its torso from its body with one fell swoop. The halves of the beast toppled to the ground. A line of Gen approached in tight formation, armed with pikes. This called for something flashy. Perhaps he could scare them into chaos. Pierce dashed for the formation's flank, as if he meant to go around them. They held their ground and pivoted to keep their pikes levelled at him. He knew the points of their weapons couldn't pierce his armour, even at the weak spots, but they could bludgeon him or hem him in and pin him down. They could try for a lucky stab into his eye slit. He was not invincible. Before he crossed beyond the line of Gen, he dashed back inward, with his sword drawn to face them. He moved dangerously close, pointed his blast gauntlet back behind him, and fired it. He covered a dozen yards in an instant, vision going grey, straining his arm to keep the blade held out and steady. It cleaved through the Gen like butter, slicing through pikes, armour, flesh and bone. Half the line of soldiers fell, cut apart, or at least with mortal wounds to the gut. The second rank of Gen stepped up to fill the gap, but they looked unsure. Pierce dashed away as pikes were thrust in his direction. A blinding flash of blue lit up the ground and all the combatants, and Pierce looked up at its source before he could control the instinct. 2 more flashes followed, leaving an azure after-image in his eyes. Then the whole sky lit up blue. The Underlanders all stopped in their tracks and screamed. Many cowered, covering their eyes with their hands. The blue light stood in stark contrast to the rising red sun, making the old tentacled thing look all the redder. For a moment he thought the sun's tendrils actually recoiled at the sudden brightness, and the titanic red beast seemed much, much closer than he'd ever thought it was. The sky took on an aspect Pierce had never seen before. It had a texture. There were swirls and lines drawn across it like carvings on a wall, and the area around the sun was painted a colour Pierce had never seen before either, a hue between blue and red. He almost thought it was an illusion. The glorious moment of light was all too brief. A fiery flash lit up the tower's zenith, and the newly blue sky went black again. Several figures came plummeting down off the tower, tossed like ragdolls by the explosion. The first had failed, and Gorgonbane had failed to protect him. Pierce's heart sank deeper than it ever had before. His depression quickly became the fuel to ignite a bonfire of rage, as red as the sun above. He lost track of the moments as he began to cut through the Underlanders like a thresher through wheat. His became a world of limbs and blood and liquid bone. Even when he slipped in the gory muck, he managed to lash out and slay whoever was unfortunate enough to be near. He had a recollection later of one of the bounding shadows coming in to attack. It was a male of the race, like Gen but black where they were grey. He had childlike features similar to S's and a bearing full of confidence that also reminded Pierce of her. If the Dark Gen had been possessed of magic, he might have been a match for Pierce, but he was merely a skilled fighter and acrobat, and Pierce cut into his heart, melting the bone of his ribs. He thought, how dare they? Why try to take Overland from those to whom it belonged? Why this evil? If they would not back down, they must be slain. Pierce came to the end of a swath of destruction, having created a lull in the battle by killing so many Gen. There was a sound. He must have gotten away from Scythia unless she had been harmed. He came back to himself and scanned the area around the tower. S's orange orbs were swirling about, shooting Gen through their hearts, so S was okay, despite the fall from above. There was Agrithor, jaws open in a piercing cackle, launching streams of lightning from his skeletal fingers. Gen tried to flee, but the electricity moved among them as if they were made of metal, burning into their backs and out their eyes. Scythia was indeed far off, but on her feet and toppling another obelisk. Where was Axborn and the First and Sev? Pierce spun and looked toward the tower's outer gate. The huge Forge Master was there, swinging a long iron bar at the ranks of approaching Gen. His face was impassive, as if he were calmly exterminating vermin. How did he feel about slaying his former countrymen? This had to end. Where was the enemy commander? Pierce could see no evidence of an officer. Must he go and slay every last one of them for this to stop? The ground had been rumbling this whole time, and now it shook in earnest, knocking even Pierce off balance. A black pillar broke the surface of the ground, more than a pillar, slightly rounded on top and thick as the tower of Chasmgard itself. There were ridges engraved in the black-shaped surface like the prints of a finger. Pierce's heart stopped. Was that a finger? 3 more towers emerged, another shortly after. The attacking Gen and remaining werewolves began to flee. On the far side of Chasmgard, another 5 towers were rising, all thick and dark and ridged with those patterns like fingerprints. They flexed, bending to grip the earth. It couldn't be, but it had to be. Pierce's mind couldn't grasp it well enough to admit what he knew was true. This was not a mega monstrosity, but something more. What more can there be? Pierce thought. An ultra monstrosity? There was a deafening series of cracks, pops, and rumbles. Sounds louder than anything Pierce had ever heard. The earth beneath him shuddered, lurched downward, sending his stomach into his throat. What his body thought was solid ground tilted downward toward the chasm. The tower's annex came off its supports and tumbled into the dark, taking who knew how much of F's knowledge with it. The main tower flared with the green light of its protective enchantment, trying to hold itself together. Gravity won the battle and the tower snapped halfway up. Green light flared again, dimmed into nothingness, and the stone blocks of the ancient structure began to cascade away into the void. There was a final jolt, and Pierce entered a seemingly endless freefall, down and away from the red light of the sun.